Good morning, everyone. It is a great pleasure to be here, surrounded by so many esteemed colleagues, and especially in a room with so much brain power in it. So please bear with me. So I will start by the usual, but my opinions are just mine, not necessarily of my institutions. But after that, let me start with a very basic observation. This very basic observation is that technology is evolving exponentially fast. And not just that, but the adoption of these technologies is basically being exponential too. This generates a very significant change in the way we live. And it is starting to touch every aspect of our lives, from the simplest to the most complex. And from that perspective, it is important to identify the different changes that this will imply in terms of what we need to do from the financial sector perspective and from the settlement of transactions perspective. So nowadays, most of whatever we do every day are at least indirectly touched by the digital realm. But just think about what will happen when the Internet of Things come actually to full force. Everything will be touched by the digital realm. And whoever is left out of the digital inclusion, at least from the payments perspective, will be left out of society as a whole. And the gap will be basically much more important than the gap that we see now. Here's an example of how big this change is, at least in the financial sector, is that one of the most stable institutions there is, the central banking community, is starting to get engaged very much into innovation. And not just that, but actually analyzing a significant change in direction. So this is quite important, and it is very interesting, given that the stability, robustness, and all these features were cherished and built upon by central bankers to get trust from societies. So seeing central bankers starting to analyze pathways in terms of doing things differently is quite interesting and gives you an idea of the magnitude of the change that is coming for the financial sector. Technology, however, can be a little bit blinding, and the glitter is not always gold. And there's a lot of hype in technology. And therefore, we need to step 2 steps back and try to analyze why we're doing this. Because we risk to be in a situation in which we lose the perspective on why we were actually analyzing these technologies to begin with. And I think that in many occasions, this is what is happening. But on the other side, we cannot lose track of what is going on in technology too, because we might lose several opportunities to get our societies with better services and with better products. We need to be careful not to end up with a marvelously complex, beautiful and elegant piece of technology that solves no societal issue. We need to identify those elements of technology that can help us push forward social needs and to help our societies do things in a simpler way. For that, we need to anchor our work a little bit with a vision, a long-term vision. And I believe that we need to focus on functionality. What are the exact functions that we need to provide to the society, as opposed to what technologies we need to bring to the society? So technology is important, but it is only a tool. We need to identify the actual functions that lie behind that. Now, central banks are involved in innovation now, and this might have been not necessarily something very planned 20 years ago, but it was something that hit us. And in order to know what to do with this new innovation in the central banks, we need to first understand what innovation is, or at least try to get a model of it. So I think that the simplest way of understanding innovation is just to see it as a function of social needs and technologies that are available. And with those 2 elements, you can mix and mangle all the different pieces of technology to solve the different requirements of societies. So the harder or the most important or the more important that the social need is, the more intense the innovation process will be. And it is also very important to say that the set of technologies that you start with determine a lot what the path will be looking forward. So if you start with a country or a situation in which you have a very efficient payment system, you might use that as the basis for your CBDC. If you start with a very robust network of telephones, you might get that as your basis point. So it is very important where you start in order to identify what the path of innovation will look like for your particular jurisdiction, and that is very important. Now, as I said, in some manner or in some way, this innovation pathway for the central banks was a little bit forced upon us. There were like three things that are relevant. There are three things that are relevant in terms of these innovation processes. One thing is what happens when there's an environmental change. Environmental change meaning the change in technology for this case, and how this affects the consumer needs and how this affects the potential competition that you get into your markets. So let me take this down to the CBDC example. So the CBDC example, the environmental change or the fundamental initial change that we saw was the Bitcoin paper, which is marvelously elegant and beautiful, right? And then after that, it was cemented by the Ethereum possibility of generating programmable money and to program on top of this on these new virtual assets. And this opened up and changed the environment from one in which we needed centralized institutions to provide trust to one in which we could basically allow the trust to flow through the code. And that was very important because it reduced the need for intermediaries, and not just in the financial sector. So this started with the financial sector, but it is applicable for every intermediary, and this is why you see the Web 3.0 and why you see identity and why you see so many things that are taking advantage of these ideas in the decentralization revolution, if you might call it somehow. Based on this environmental change, you can see that some of the latent consumer needs or desires started surfacing. So people were not very happy with the products that were provided to them by the financial institutions. We always complain about the service and we always complain about the price. So whenever you see that there is a possibility of doing away with these intermediaries that we don't like so much, you get excited and the demand starts pushing up for this type of new solutions. So this is a latent need that surfaced because of this environmental change. Some people were left out altogether. So this is the problem with financial exclusion. And of course, these people, in the moment they have this other opportunity to join the services, of course, increase the demand too. The third part, or the third element, given the environmental change, is how this can generate new competitors coming into the market. So new firms or new consortia could start providing some services that before were only allowed for financial institutions. But this change in the environment actually generated the possibility for newcomers to enter and provide services in a different way. This is particularly important in the case of CBDC because what we actually see, and if you analyze what Bitcoin or other types of pure virtual assets do, is basically create some sort of private money. When you see history and you start analyzing what happens whenever there is a period in which people start printing out money, you always end up with the same result, which is a problem for societies and destruction of social welfare due to the creation of private money. You also see lots of opportunistic behavior. So if I see my neighbor creating private money, why shouldn't I? And this situation starts composing, and in the end, the people who pay are the people who are least experienced or with least understanding of the monetary system and their underpinnings. So it is quite important to actually take a look at what is going on from this side and see that this competitive pressure by private money issuers can affect societies and whether central banks should do something about it or not. So all these issues generated a little bit of this push, this unintended push for central banks to actually move from the traditional stability to start analyzing what we need to do in order to provide services to societies and to avoid certain problems that we might face if these things got out of control. from the perspective of private money provision and from the perspective of financial stability. Now, these environmental changes generate lots of dust. So whenever you move something that big, it generates a big cloud of dust that makes it very difficult to see far away. And I think we're standing in the middle of that cloud of dust. And it goes a little bit into the glittering part of technology. We cannot actually see the fundamental change and how profound this fundamental change will actually be. So I believe that a lot of dust settlement is required, and that dust settlement requires a lot of analysis and a lot of these type of seminars to actually discuss ideas and to try to do away with some of the dust to identify the actual final change that we will look at from a societal perspective. And the DLT and blockchain is just one example of this, right? So when you see some people claiming that the DLT and blockchain will change the world completely and will change almost everything that we do, I think this is a little bit this cloud of dust. It has a lot of very interesting uses. It has a lot of potential benefits for societies, but we still need to see exactly what those benefits are and what the killer case for these technologies is. Now, it has to be very clear that the CBDC does not mean DLT and blockchain. And this is something that is very clear for some, but not for everyone. So lots of people think when they hear the word CBDC, they immediately go to a blockchain or a DLT. And that is not the case. So let me take this discussion back to the basics. Let me take this discussion back to the functionality that I believe would be necessary for a CBDC. And let me start with a definition. The basic definition of a CBDC, from my perspective, you will see many definitions around, right? So it is very difficult to get the consensus on a definition on a CBDC, but mine is very easy and very simple. It's just digital high-powered money, or digital M0. And this represents a liability for the central bank. So that's basic definition from my perspective of a CBDC. Now, in terms of the function that this digital representation of money should have, I think there are three very fundamental issues that might change the way many things are done. The first one is that it has to have a settlement capability, and a highly scalable one too. If you consider the Internet of Things and the future demand for the settlement of transactions, we need to have something that is completely scalable and that allows everyone to join in and be able to settle transactions. The second one has to do with interoperability with existent sources of, for example, digital M1. So we need to generate a layer that would allow everyone to join in and for every person to be able to pay every other person, even if they are not connected to the same network. The third one has to do with a standard setting within the programmability of money. So having digital money in any way possible, what allows you to do is to have conditional settlement. So you can basically generate ifs for when you want your settlement to go ahead. And this is not just the case for blockchain and DLT. Again, this can be done centrally. Just with the only requirement is that you need to have digital currency. And the problem with leaving this in the open and not having a centralized standard is that this is very complicated. And lots of people can be lost in the complications of the code. And this generates a significant information asymmetry problem. But let me go into detail in each one of these three elements. So the first one has to do with the settlement and how we allow for everyone to be able to settle transactions with everyone else. Electronic payments are the stepping stone of financial inclusion. So whenever you saw electronic payments in the past, that was the first step. And then after payments, you could get credits and you could get mortgages and you could get some other financial services that were more advanced. So that's just a stepping stone in the pyramid. The effect of payment exclusion, the electronic payment exclusion in the past, implied that people would not get this higher level financial services. But if you take into consideration how this stuff started, now people that got excluded from the payment services would be excluded from many dimensions of life. So just consider in the future that doctor appointments would be done online and paid for online. If you don't have access to an electronic means of payment, you're out of doctor or education or any other thing that requires an electronic settlement. So this is really, really challenging. And even for countries that have low levels of financial exclusion, this is a very significant problem because it is not acceptable to have 1 or 2% of your population left away or left out of these basic services because they don't have a digital means of payment. So this kind of starts taking the shape of a public good that needs to be provided by some central entity for everyone without the need for that service or that function to be ready travel to anyone else. It might seem exaggerated what I will say, but if the digital penetration of our lives continue with the rate that we're seeing right now, in the future, it might even make sense to make having access to electronic payments a basic right. Because this basic right would allow you access to some of the basic rights. So I think it might seem exaggerated to some, but I think it is the case. A CBDC with this capability would solve this conundrum and would help us go forward. The second element is interoperability. So with interoperability, when you see payment systems, one of the biggest problems is that it all depends on the size of your network. So you might have the best idea for the best payment system ever, but if you only have 10,000 customers, your idea is as good as dead. Unless you can reach out to the vast majority or at least a significant segment of society with your payment solution is not viable. What could be done with this, and this of course leads to a loss in competitive forces. So many of these ideas that might be great are lost unless they go to the companies that have the largest networks. And this is what you see in the open market. So in the open market, you see concentrations, and you see that the basic providers of payments, I do not mean the payments that everyone here uses, because there are so many there and competition on that level is good. But if you see the rails that underpin the payments, those are very few. And they are walled gardens, and they might generate some problems in terms of competition. So a CBDC could also help in that dimension by setting up a layer to which everyone else can connect. So that if I am connected with a particular network and I want to send a payment to my friend that is connected to another particular network, that we could connect through this common platform or common layer that underlies everyone else. The third one has to do with the standards of programmability. So when you start getting into DeFi and you start getting into programmability, you start getting into really complicated stuff. And this is not really complicated in a way that can be solved or that can be shared with people. So I can say, I can open my code for you, but I don't know how many in this room would be able to identify a backdoor in a DeFi protocol. I will not be. So if you manage to get this and you identify how many DeFi protocols are out there, you start identifying the problem with the asymmetric information that this generates. So just imagine how difficult it is. So take how difficult it is now for a person to identify whether a bank is good or not. So we still have problems there. Now take that and add the complexity of code and that the complexity of a fully programmable money, and then you're out of this world. So even if you see expert programmers around the table and you put 10 different DeFi protocols around the table, it will be very difficult for them to identify which one is a good one and which one is bad. So this asymmetric information problem needs to be, the dimensionality of this problem needs to be lowered by setting up standards that could allow everyone to at least code in the same platform or code in the same with the same characteristics or rules. Because in the end, this programmability is just like having a virtual computer. So you can do basically everything. If you have a virtual computer, you can program whatever you want. And for common people to actually understand this is just possible. So those three elements, I think, are basic functionalities that we need to embed in CBDCs. So the settlement function that is fully scalable to allow for financial inclusion, the interoperability part that serves as a big pipe. I like to compare what this could do with the plumbing of the city. This might be like the big tubes that bring all the water to the cities. And then the private sector solutions are just the solutions for the houses and how they install faucets and shower heads and so on. But this basic infrastructure doesn't need to be replicated 10, 15 times. It just needs to be one set of infrastructure that is super robust, that can actually withstand all the things that are on top. And in the programmability side, we don't want to have metric versus English versus Chinese units of measurement. We need to have one unit of measurement so that it is easy to understand what is going on and how to install my faucets on top of that big plumbing. Sorry if that was too casual. But now I'm left with the question, why central banks, right? So it might make sense to say, well, let's let the private sector do it. But I have certain points that why I think that central banks are the correct institution to do it. So the first one is that we are already partially doing it. So if you consider that central banks have had computers for 70 years, and we have been managing monetary policy accounts for those 50, 60 years, you can identify that we have already issued a digital M0 or a CBDC with our wholesale wholesale payment systems. So we are already providing some sort of CBDC to the financial institutions. The second one is that we, of course, have a direct liabilities held by the general public in the form of bills and coins. So shifting that, and instead of giving them a piece of paper, giving them a piece of gold doesn't seem so much of a difference. Now, going to the second point, the central bank mandates. When you see the mandates vary slightly from one jurisdiction to the other, and besides inflation, which is a controversial topic now, but I'll focus on the others. We have that many central banks have mandates in terms of settlement, they have mandates in terms of providing currency, and they have mandates in terms of development of the financial sector and financial stability. All of these mandates are consistent with issuing a CBDC. And it is actually just an evolution, just as governments started changing from gold coins to paper money. This is just another way of shifting from paper money to digital money. This is also consistent with the history of central banks. So central banks in the beginning, you see the history and how different central banks were created. In particular, for example, the Fed was created to reduce this problem with different types of private money circulating, or not private money, but conflicting types of money circulating around. And this was the case for many central banks around the world. And another reason why central banks were created was to provide central infrastructure. So if you see the first central banks in Europe, in Sweden, and so on, they were creating this nodes that could allow for the different banks to actually connect to get this interoperability going and so on. There are other issues, including the providing credit to the government, so that one we don't like anymore. So again, and then the final point here is that why not allowing just the private sector to provide this is because we see two sets of problems. The first one is we see many market failures in the provision of these three functions that I mentioned before. So I mentioned information asymmetries in terms of understanding the programmability of money. We have problems with the industrial organization of these things related with the cost structure of the provision of these services. What do I mean by this? We have a natural monopoly cost structure in most of this provision. We have very high fixed costs and very low marginal costs. And this implies that the optimal solution from an economic perspective is to go to a natural monopoly. And so you can do two things with a natural monopoly, either regulate completely or provide it yourself. So it makes sense to provide it themselves. And then the positive externalities of having everyone in the loop, in the digital financial ecosystem. which is not an externality that is internalized directly by the market. So those are the market failures that occur in the provision of these functions and that we cannot do away with. So it makes sense for this to be provided as a sort of public good from a centralized perspective. Also, and this is more, this is not so strong, but if central banks do not provide this function, they will become irrelevant in the provision of currency. And that is also quite important when you think that the monetary policy is quite important in terms of enhancing social welfare. I believe that the central banks have a lot of trust that was built through the decades. And I think that central banks might use pieces of these new technologies in order to enhance that trust that central banks already have to provide the largest benefits to society. And loss of dust is still in the air. And that's why I am so happy to be here with all of you to discuss and try to put down some of that dust. Thank you so much.
We have a few more minutes for questions before we go in the break. Floor is open.
Hi, I'm Daniel Andre from McGill University. So you were talking about having one unique, robust infrastructure, but this also has a downside because if that infrastructure has a major flaw, but in finance we are taught, we teach our students to diversify. So I believe that actually there must be some kind of a trade-off. And also discourages innovation if we force having only one infrastructure.
Yeah, you're completely right. And the way we solve that is by generating lots of robustness protocols within the system, including non-similar facilities. So if you manage to get your system super robust and you get 4 or 5 layers of disaster recovery plans on that infrastructure, you're not yet there. You need to generate a completely separate system that would allow you to shift from one system to the other in case there is a catastrophic problem. So let me share with you a little bit my background on this. I was a general director of financial market infrastructures in Mexico, and we faced that problem, that exact problem many times. What can we do when we have just one central infrastructure, and that infrastructure, if that falls down, then you get all the country in trouble. In this case, more than just one country possibly. So the thing is, you have to embed in your developments this type of redundancy and reliability, and not be dependent on one particular type of technology, but actually having the possibility to switch from one to another in a simple way. And this is a little bit how systemic payment systems are designed. So you design them as robust as you can, but then you don't stop there. You create another one with a completely different set of technology, completely different set of hardware, so that you can switch from one to the other seamlessly from the perspective of the final user. And I agree, there's some trade-off in terms of how many ideas you can fit in. You can only develop 2 or 3 systems, but I think even the externalities and the cost structure of these things, it makes sense to have that type of approach.
So thank you, Miguel. This is very helpful. Okay, I do agree with the 3 ingredients that you mentioned, but I have a question about programmability. So do we think that programmability should be run on central bank money? Yeah, I guess it's a big open question.
Not necessarily. So what I try to convey is that we need to have a standard to reduce the dimensionality of the problem with the information symmetry. So this does not mean that everything has to run with the central bank money. So you can have a digital M1 that has the same standard as a digital M0, and you can have programs, or you can have conditional settlements with both of them. You can actually have conditional settlement in M0 versus M1, just as you have with the traditional financial institutions now. So you have M1 and you have M0, and they interoperate seamlessly. So the idea is to generate an environment in which that can happen. This does not imply that the central bank will have control on everything that happens, but it's only like a standard setting mechanism that can allow everyone to speak with each other in a simpler way and to provide the final users with a simpler way to understand the complications of this type of solution. But it's a great question because sometimes this is misunderstood as if the central bank would like to bring all the services and all the financial sector to itself. This is not. It's just like providing these platforms that will allow for everyone to provide the services. The central bank will not be able to generate all the innovation necessary for the social needs to be taken care of.
Last one, maybe Daryl can.
Thanks. Miguel, you aptly characterized a significant payment system as a natural monopoly. And then you said there are two choices. You can regulate, as a government, you can regulate, or you can do it yourself. And then you seem to suggest do it yourself. I'm wondering if you could explain why you feel that do it yourself is better than regulate.
Of course, because the natural monopoly was just one of the problems in the market favors, right? So we also have the information asymmetries, and we also have the non-internalized positive externalities of having everyone joining. So with the private sector, what we have seen in the 70 years, and don't get me wrong, I think that the private sector has done an amazing job in providing digital M0 to certain segments of the population that are worth it for them. So the point is, how do we manage to provide these services to those individuals and populations that are not worth it for the private sector? And then one thing that you could say is we could push the banks to do it, and we could mandate for the opening of accounts. But I can tell you from the Latin American perspective that doesn't work very well. Because even though you mandate for the obligation to open accounts, what you see is that the banks put that like they nudge you as not to be getting that type of products. And what eventually happens is that the people that actually needs more of this type of services get disencouraged because the incentives are not to provide the service. And here, Darrell, I don't mean that it cannot be done. It could, but it would require a supervision that goes beyond any supervision that has been done in the past. So just making sure that every person that walks into a private bank branch or whatever gets a service they need is quite complicated. And I find that it is possible that if you provide a substitute good, it might be that the substitute good is not so much used. So it might be that the CBDC is not used a lot, but it generates incentives to the other side to actually start providing themselves. One example that we saw in cross-border payments is so the cross-border payments from Mexico, from the US to Mexico. We generated this system with the Fed called Fed Now and Directo Mexico. And we expected that to be a boom, right? Because the price was so low and the exchange rate was amazing and so on. And what we saw was that the system was not very much used. But when you saw the price and the number of transactions going on in the private sector, given that that alternative was available, it was impressive. So this is the same case here. You might not have as big of a use within the CBDC, but if this pushes the private sector to actually start providing these services to that segment of the population that was not catered for, that's great, and that's part of the objective. This is why the functional part is so good. We don't need to provide it ourselves, but it is one way of pushing everyone else and pushing the market to actually start providing it in a better way.